to this edition of FIFPRO Forum. I'm Samantha Johnson, and I'm absolutely delighted to be your host in this beautiful city I call home, Istanbul, ahead of the men's UEFA Champions League final. Now, as you can see, when it comes up, the title of this event is Beyond Growth, Player Workload and Financial Sustainability. And I'm pleased to say that we do have a stellar lineup when it comes to our panels and some brilliant speakers as well. But before we start today's proceedings, just a few housekeeping notes. Now, this year's event will be live streamed via the website fifpro.org, so make sure that everybody is on their best behavior, please, and make sure your phones are off or on silent. Thank you. And of course, this is an international family, so we have various languages, but you do have translation available on your headsets. Just to let you know, number 1 is English, 2 is French, and 3 is Spanish. So let's get this started. To officially kick things off, I'd like to welcome the president of FIFPRO Europe, Mr. David Terrier.
It's better for me and much easier for you to understand what I will speak about. Bienvenue.
Well, welcome to this new edition of the FIFPRO Forum. I would have a tendency to say that we don't need to have one anymore, but you will discover that this is not true, because you will see the figures that have a downward tendency. So we do have to repeat these events. It is important that you are here, so I'd like to thank you for being here. The first thing for which we are here is to support also our Turkish friends, because they lived a tragedy. And it seemed important to us, FIFPRO, but also to the full board of FIFPRO Europe to be present and to be next to the Turkish Union. We want to show our solidarity, as we've done from the first day. We continue our relationships, and we will continue to help the Turkish Union. Well, today they did a great job, and this also proves that we can stand up and that we can even face the worst tragedies. I would like to thank also the persons present here, the journalists. It's very important for us that you're here, because the players speak to us, they come to us, and they talk about the problems that they face. The workload is not bearable anymore, but you have the power to communicate this. And the fact that you're present and also in big numbers, well, leads to hope that this news will be communicated in the whole world by us, but also thanks to you. You will echo our comments, and this will maybe change the mentalities. We will address, during this new edition, the topic that you know. There are 2 parts. First of all, there's the workload, and you will see that Benchmark, our partner, did a lot of work. You can see this back in the messages on the wall, all the witness statements that you see there. We cannot just wait and listen, and we cannot just let the players undergo this, because players are protesting, and the figures are incredible. And look at these figures. You will see the difference between what we had in the past and what the current situation is. The differences are big, and you can't have the same career and the same duration of your career. And we as FIFPRO, we have to protect the players. That is very obvious. We want to protect them physically, but also mentally. There's Rafael Varane. He is 29 years old, and he made a choice because he felt obliged to not continue to defend the cause of his country. And we are the representatives of the players, and for us, this is a disaster. We were not able to make our voices heard sufficiently, and FIFA and UEFA, they should take into account the physical and mental health of the players. Secondly, there is another development, and that is the financial balance. Well, very often they say that money is the nerve of the war. And in fact, here in Europe, we want to have this balance because we have like a pyramid in Europe. And in the last time, we had Maheta, our representative, and also the general manager of the English Union, and myself. We are part of a UEFA committee, and what we try to do is that we try to explain that if you want to have a financial balance, then this shouldn't be at the cost of the players. We cannot talk about salary caps, etc. No, we have to have a global vision. And we will have the presentations today, and on the basis of that, you will understand that we can only block the salaries of the player or the total wage bill, but we as FIFPRO, but also UEFA, we have the responsibility to respect the balance. And where we see this pyramid, we should be innovators. We should be the engine as to various elements, not only concerning the salaries, but we should talk about the quality of the staff, the squad size limit. We should talk about the redistribution, about the prize monies, and we should also talk about how we can remunerate the players. And there we do not only talk about salaries, but also about retraining, and this on a daily basis. This is also a balance. It's not only money, but it's also about football in general. And, well, I talked a bit more than I'd foreseen. I do not want to continue much more before I pass on the floor to the person who manages and is the head of the Players Union here, Mehmet, my friend. And of course, he is in a very difficult situation, physically and mentally. And it is an honor for me that he can be here today, and that he represents the players of his countries, and that even there he can be here. Because a couple of months ago, he was extremely sad, and he didn't see a bright future. But of course, it's still difficult for him. Maybe we'll talk about it. But he will speak in a very proud way about the Turkish people who are able to stand up. And we, as like all the players, we have to express that it is not only about football, because there are more important things in life than football. We have to be reasonable, and that's what we try to be today. Well, we will show it to you when showing the figures. That's it. Saffet, please come on stage.
First of all, I'd like to thank you. FIFPRO is coming to Turkey for the first time. I wish that they will be enjoying their 3 days here and live here with very nice memories. With FIFPRO, we have had this cooperation for over 4 years. And I'd like to thank all the FIFPRO authorities that help us join this family, because we went through a very challenging period. Hakan Ünsal, in the previous management, also greatly contributed to this process, and I'd like to thank you very much for completing this and for making us a suitable society for FIFPRO. I'd like to thank him very much for his past help. I'd like to give you a couple figures about our society. We were established in 1992. The main reason why it was established is to basically help the players that quit football. But once we got integrated with FIFPRO, what we have seen is, well, we should help the football players when they're active and raise their awareness so that, well, they can, because, you know, problems are always experienced after they quit, but there is this, there are different problems in Turkey. So we thought that if we could basically train them and raise their awareness, they will not feel the need of anyone afterwards. So when we sat together with the European societies and talked about that, we, have seen that we need to help them when they're active players. So afterwards, our society developed a new vision for itself, changed the previous one. So what does our society do for the active football players? Let me talk about that, especially at the beginning of the season. For the players who have not found well club for themselves, we offer them camp services, we offer legal services, lawyering services. As you know, there might be many problems between the clubs and the players in legal terms. Also, we make measurements, FMS measurements for the football players at the beginning of the season. And we are a society of 4 years only, so we are aware that the harmonization period is going slow. So to the extent possible, to catch up with the other FIFPRO members, we are making an enormous effort, but there are realities of our own country. I'd like to talk about that now. For the past 4 years, the revenues of the clubs on a dollar basis, as you know, there has been a huge devaluation of TL in Turkey. And so the revenues of the clubs have been lost. The revenues of the federation have been lost. So that's why there are so many problems between the well, of course, the clubs and the federation. When we are involved in the problems of the football players, we have seen that the clubs, well, basically are focusing more on their individual problems, and we obviously had a hard time meeting at common ground. So in order to solve this problem, we need to be working together. Hopefully, with your support, our society will become a more active one. We have this other problem, of course, after the pandemic, unfortunately, in our country, we had a tragic incident. It was an incident of 100th century. I would like to show you a brief video about that. Sorry, this is not audible through the headphones. So earthquake is a reality of our lives. It took the lives of 50,000 citizens, unfortunately, and many organizations have supported us on a global basis. I'd like to thank each and every one of them. While I'd like to say a couple remarks about how earthquake reflected on football. After the earthquake, professional 9 clubs had to retreat from the league. While with 9 teams retreating, of course, many football players were victimized. And during this process, we had discussions with the federation to talk about how we can include them in the system. And briefly to say, we have 14 foreigners rule in Turkey, and we gave the right to transfer an extra 1 foreign player. And also, we have given another right to the ones who already had this right. And also, there was an age limitation in the first league. We made it more flexible, and we had the opportunity to re-include the players into the system. After the earthquake, after we have created fields for them to play, while there were other victimizations, so I'd like to talk about what happened. So football players, especially, while those who had family members lost in the earthquake or had problems with housing and who have been idle. We contacted these football players, and for around 80 football players, we extended financial aid to the extent our budget allowed. And later on, we offered them legal services because there is, great victimization within the clubs, also within the families. Our lawyers supported them. Also, for the football players who became idle, we extended them financial aid. So we had the opportunity to basically a little bit reduce their grief. And our federation had this campaign called Shoulder to Shoulder. A revenue was generated globally from there. I'd like to once again thank FIFPRO family. Under the scope of this project, they made a huge donation, and this donation was utilized to help our citizens. So thank you again. And also a separate thanks goes to the Italian Federation, who helped us during these formidable times, while they also made their own donation. As a result, as a federation, we would like to become a good society that is able to catch up. The other European federations would like to basically create permanent values. We are doing our best. We know about our hardships, the hardships of our country, but they will only make us more resilient. Hopefully, the future is bright. Thank you very much for your attendance.
Thank you very much for that touching tribute. We really do appreciate you being here, and thank you very much, David, for your opening words as well. Okay, so the first part of the forum, we're going to be focusing on player welfare. Now, it's going to be a huge issue throughout the whole day. We're talking about player welfare, the mental health of our players as well, and how it impacts them, not just, I suppose, physically, but mentally as well. But before we hear from our esteemed panel, I'd like to bring on Michael Leahy from the Policy and Strategic Relations team at FIFPRO, who will introduce the key findings of the Player Workload Report.
Thank you, Samantha. Hello, everybody. For the next few minutes, I'll guide you through the key findings from this year's annual report. You all have a copy of it beside you, so I'd urge you to take it away with you today and delve a bit deeper into all of the insights that we'll provide a snapshot of here. It's also available online for those who prefer to read digitally from the FIFPRO website from this afternoon. So just to give you a brief overview of player workload monitoring and what the reports mean for us, for those who aren't familiar. This is our third annual report, building on the report at the end of each of the last two seasons. And for the season that was in it this year, we also constructed two flash reports, which are mini pieces of analysis that we conduct throughout the season on various workload issues. And those mini reports are the two smaller images you'll see on the screen there, and they were constructed before and after the World Cup, analysing the workload effect that they had on players in the early part of the season and then following the season. An interesting part to note about the second mini report we released in February was that it included the views of some of the World Cup participating players on various issues like player health, mental health, and tournament timing. So that brings us to the report on the right, which is the report we're all here to talk about today, which is our third annual report. And this provides a snapshot of the workload analysis of the entire season from the player's perspective on a number of different workload issues, which we'll discuss in turn here. We've picked out 4 key findings, which you'll see on screen, and a little bit of a recap about the World Cup, but there's a lot more information involved also in the report itself, as you'll see. So the first key finding that came out was quite obvious to us from the report, and it's quite evident over recent seasons. There's been an increasing danger to the physical and mental health of players across the industry, especially at the leading level. You'll see there a couple of the different metrics that we use to measure this. It's the combination of these different metrics, well, not one individually, but the combination of them all together that contribute to workload overall. For example, you'll see some of the standout statistics that we've listed there in terms of match calendar, Bruno Fernandes's back-to-back games, which we'll come back to in a second, the amount of competitions that Rodri participated in, and then there's other elements like travel. As you'll see, Georgian Diaraschiata, who's actually the leading player in terms of travel distance this season for us in our metrics, who plays with Uruguay and Flamengo in Brazil, for those who don't know. And travel is another factor that's sometimes overlooked in the overall workload analysis of players when that's conducted at the end of the season. Recovery was a prominent issue this season. You'll see 2 players picked out there for their post-World Cup recovery, or the lack thereof, with such a short period between the end of the season, or between the end of the World Cup and the restart of their league seasons. And then mental fatigue is something that we'll talk about a lot more on the panel later, but it's something that should be kept in mind. The player survey that are referenced there in our flash report during the season brought out that 43% stat you'll see there. Now that refers to 43% of players who we surveyed at the World Cup experienced extreme or increased mental fatigue compared to the same point at recent seasons, and that was January when we conducted the survey. So I think there's quite clearly an extra additional mental fatigue element this season, which became evident from the data and then also from the players' perspectives themselves. So just go on to Bruno Fernandes for a second. You'll see his stats there on the left-hand side of the screen, various different workload metrics. But what I'd like you to focus on is the bottom left corner, the consecutive back-to-back matches. And the reason why that is important is because we think back-to-back matches is a key indicator of injury susceptibility and players under fatigue, and that can have serious consequences for their physical and their mental health. And for those who don't know, FIFPRO define a back-to-back match as a match that takes place within 5 days of the previous game. And in that state, generally players will not have fully recovered physically and maybe mentally, and therefore more susceptible to injuries, or can be. Now, it's unrealistic to expect there to be no back-to-back matches in modern football. Of course, there's going to be back-to-back matches at various points of the season, but it's this increased cumulative exposure. For example, Bruno's 20 streak there of constantly playing without having 5 days of recovery. And it's that cumulative exposure that strongly increases the risk of injury and poses a danger to player health and performance. So that's the one metric I'd like you to look out for throughout the report. Before we go on to the next slide, I'd just like you to reflect for one moment on 243 days. Think about what you could achieve in 243 days, or think about what you would have to forego in 243 days if you had to give up those days to do something else, of your private life, of your spare time. Think about what you'd miss out on. And the reason I'm asking is because 243, if we can get to the next slide, is the amount of days that Raphael Varane spent in French national team camp between the start of the preparation period for the last World Cup in Russia and the end of the World Cup in Qatar. And this is obviously on top of all his club commitments, which are already very extensive and very extreme in terms of playing for Real Madrid and now Manchester United in various different club competitions. But on top of that, that 243 days stat really stood out to us as well, and the impact that has then on your family life, on spending time with friends, and all the related aspects around your life. And you'll see his quote there on the right. He has a series of quotes once he retired, as David already mentioned, which I think emphasize the workload toll that are on the top players today. Moving on to our second finding, the detrimental industry impact of the unsustainable workload demands. Now, it's quite obvious if a player gets injured, their physical or mental health is damaged, but the actual industry impact is often overlooked. What does this mean? On clubs, on leagues, on federations, on competition organisers, the actual cost of these injuries is sometimes not fully evaluated and not fully taken into account of when they construct the calendar in the first place. You'll see here a list of injuries from across the top 5 European leagues this season, and it's broken down into soft tissue injuries and not soft tissue injuries. The reason we've done that is because we think there's a link between the back-to-back matches and the soft tissue injuries. If you're constantly, cumulatively, playing under when you're not fully recovered, you have a greater risk of picking up a soft tissue injury. And there's quite a high number of those throughout the season across all of the leagues, and we think that's a factor in the calendar congestion, which then impacts the recovery period of the players and then impacts the soft tissue injuries that they've suffered to an extent. And we delved a little bit deeper into the data on the injuries across the leagues, and we compared it with the recovery or the restart times of the various European leagues after the World Cup. And what this is showing, and what shows more detailed in the report, the leagues, for example, like the Premier League and Liga, which restarted in late December, relatively soon after the World Cup, compared to a league like the Bundesliga, which did not restart until later in January and gave the players a proper rest. When we analysed the February and March period across all of those leagues, there was a much higher injury incidence rate in those leagues that restarted very quickly, as opposed to the ones that did give the players the rest throughout after the World Cup and then throughout early January. So I think it just emphasises in a snapshot the impact that recovery period and how important it could be. On the right there, I've just listed a couple of players who've been particularly impacted and missing key moments this season, in a large part due to the calendar congestion. Sadio Mane, for example, you remember, picked up a relatively short-term injury close to the World Cup. Because of the short preparation period in this year's World Cup, rather than the 3 or 4 weeks that usually leads into the tournament, he was forced to miss the tournament because of that. Virgil van Dijk played, had a very congested early half of the season, played at the World Cup, came back to club football in England, straight into another congested part of the season, and picked up an injury in early January, which kept him out for another couple of months. And you'll see him on the wall today with an interesting quote that refers to that as well. And finally, Kylian Mbappe. Again, he had a fantastic World Cup, a congested early part of the season, but a fantastic early season in World Cup. Came back straight into Ligue 1 football, and in that January, February hectic period of time, congested fixtures, he got injured again, and then he was forced to, when the Champions League returned, he wasn't fully fit, and he spent the first game on the bench rather than starting as he would normally. But my reason for saying this is that it shows the impact on the different competition organisers or the different stakeholders. For example, FIFA were without one of the leading African players for the World Cup. UEFA were without Kylian Mbappe when they returned for the Champions League. And Virgil van Dijk missed a lot of Premier League games. So it just highlights the different impacts that the calendar congestion, which then creates the injuries, can then have on the different various stakeholders around the industry, and not just on the players themselves. So our third key finding, the risk to career longevity. What do we mean by career longevity? It's the ability of our best young players today across the globe to continue playing at the high level for a sustained period deep into their later careers, which is obviously what everyone wants to do. They're the players that everyone enjoys watching most, and we want them to continue their careers as successfully as possible. But what's become apparent is that the workload toll on these young players today is becoming increasingly higher and higher, even compared with the leading players of the previous generation. So what you'll see here on this stat is the amount of minutes, first team minutes, played by Jude Bellingham, one of the brightest young players in the game today, I think everyone will agree, compared to a selection of leading players across the leading English players from the quite recent generation. It does make me feel strange a little bit to call Gerrard, Lampard and Rooney historical comparisons, because it makes me feel old, having grown up watching them. But that is what they are, having retired a few years ago now. But I think what you'll see is that Jude Bellingham is playing a significant amount more minutes as a teenager. He's due to turn 20 later this month. But he's playing a significant amount more than even the wonder kids, as they'd be referred to, of the previous generation, and some of the biggest players. Now, it remains to be seen what impact this has later in his career, but playing the human body only has such a limit and such an amount of wear and tear it can take. And playing this significant an amount early in his career poses a question of whether that's healthy for players. And it's not just Jude Bellingham. There's other leading players from other countries who you'll see in the report in more detail, but we have a comparison with Mbappe and Henry, Pedro and Xavi, and Vinicius and Ronaldinho. And the same thing is apparent in all of those cases. The young player today is playing significantly more minutes than the comparison player from the previous generation. Now, yes, people will argue things have improved, certain recovery methods, preparation activities have improved to enable that, but not to that extent. There has been incremental improvements, but they don't negate the impact of such an additional strain on players' bodies. And just quickly to show you one of the graphs on Vinicius and Ronaldinho, on the right-hand side there you'll see a couple of figures which put it in stark terms, but the graph, the green line, is Vinicius's minutes played as he progresses through age, and the bottom line is Ronaldinho. And you'll see how already divergent they are, and that will likely only continue as the years go on. So the fourth threat. So you'd think after some of that data we've presented and the season we've just experienced, all of the congestion, a lot of the injuries and all of the debate, that maybe the stakeholders would come together and they'd be reaching a sustainable solution to make things for the better. But that isn't what's happening. What's happening is a number of competitions are actually set to expand over the coming seasons, and the problem will only get worse. Congestion, there'll be more matches, and congestion will only get worse. For example, the new Champions League is starting next year with an increase of games. The Club World Cup is likely in 2025 with an increase of games, and even the World Cup itself will have more teams and more games in its 2026 edition. So overall, there's just going to continue being a problem if this continuous increase keeps happening and putting more strain on players mentally and physically. And what you'll see here at the top is that now players won't play all 90 games, but it's possible that teams will face 90 games in a season by 2025. You'll see at the bottom there in the chart, we took a player from the Premier League, a prominent player, and compared his season in 21-22 and compared it to what it would be like in 24-25. And you'll see there's an extra 9 games, which equates to 11%. Now, will a player play all of those 89 games, or 90 if you include preseason, because preseason friendlies aren't included in that figure? Probably not, but he still shows the dramatic increase in fixtures that they'll be subjected to. And they'll obviously play more games within that, whether it's the full total or not. But I think that just shows that the problem is not being solved and it's not really being worked towards a sustainable solution, and that more needs to be done to counteract those factors. So quickly then, just to take a quick look at the World Cup, which obviously had an aggregating effect on this season. The factors we've laid out already are standalone, and they'll still continue to be the case, but the World Cup obviously impacted those stats already. One big factor for us was the preparation and recovery times in compared with previous World Cups. So you'll see the preparation time there. That's compared with the normal preparation time from previous tournaments, compared to this year's tournament, or last year's tournament, which was 7 days. Again, like we referred to in Sadio Mane's case, this kind of shortened preparation time firstly rules out certain players from playing, but then also tactically and physically, from when we spoke to players, it impacts their preparation. Then the recovery time after, as we discussed with Varane and a couple of other players earlier, it stops them being able to recover both mentally and physically after a trying tournament to then get ready for the second half of the season, whether that's with their clubs or in more international football. So it just brings it back, and you'll see a couple of different stats from the World Cup there. One I want to draw your attention to is Achraf Hakimi, going back onto the back-to-back matches statistic, like we mentioned with Bruno earlier. And I think the next panel will probably refer to that as well, and the mental impact that can have on players by not letting them have an efficient mental recovery. But I think you'll see the short season breaks, the back-to-back matches, and the match overload are 3 key statistics that I think were bigger than ever in this season, and were obviously exacerbated by the World Cup. And there are three statistics that I think need to be improved on, whether that's through safeguards or whether that's through curtailing the calendar to an extent, but that just shows the impact of the World Cup as well. So I think just before we bring on Vincent, Samantha, you have a question?
I have a couple of questions for you, actually, and I'll let you stay on my stage because you deserve the spotlight as well. So I think what stood out for me is the fact that Rafa Varane actually took control of his own, I suppose, destiny, career, and retired at only the age of 29. What does the industry have to do to make sure that that doesn't happen again?
Well, I think historically, football as an industry has always been quite slow to change, especially on issues of player health and workload. I think historically, if you look back to even the 1980s, say the tackle from behind, dangerous tackle from behind, it took these flashpoint incidents, these major incidents, to actually stimulate change. Career-threatening injuries to Van Basten or Maradona or players like that, to actually for the lawmakers to outlaw that tackle and protect player health. If you look at technology, for example, it took major incidents like Lampard's non-goal at the World Cup in 2010 against Germany, or Henry's handball against Ireland in the playoff for the same tournament. It took these massive moments to then stimulate the introduction of modern technology to help officiating. So I think football in general is quite slow to integrate these changes unless a massive flashpoint happens and occurs to stimulate it. What we're saying is we want to put this messaging out that this is starting to happen, retirement of players at 29, leading players like Varane. That shouldn't be happening. We should be acting before it becomes this massive flashpoint, before bigger things happen. And we should take notice of these statistics and these factors and try and make change, either by curtailing the calendar to an extent, or implementing certain workload safeguards around back-to-back games, or around guaranteed season breaks, or issues like that.
Okay. And one of your other big findings was about mental health as well. And I think what's actually refreshing right now, especially as we've just come out of the pandemic, it's not really a taboo to talk about it so much. But when it comes to football, there's this little bit of a, I don't know, a little bit of a shadow over it. I mean, what's your take on it? I mean, does it need to be taken a lot more seriously amongst leagues, associations?
Absolutely. I think when we refer to mental health of players, sometimes people jump to the conclusion that it's serious mental illness we're talking about. It's not necessarily that. It's the enjoyment of their family life. It's enjoyment of their recovery time, being able to be mentally recovered for when they go to training and go to matches and tournaments. So there's a lot of different things that goes into it. But I think we are seeing players increasingly talking about it more and more. Now, there's probably two aspects to that. There's a societal aspect where mental health, I think, is talked about more generally, openly anyway. Then also the way players are talking about it. They're more willing to talk about it, probably because it's becoming such an issue that they feel they have to draw attention to it. They're becoming under such a strain that they feel they need to explain, like Van Dijk does over there, or like Varane does here. All of these players, they feel the need to speak out on it, because if they don't, nothing has changed, and it won't continue to change unless they take some action.
And a couple of players are actually taking action as well. I think it's Trent Alexander-Arnold. He's the face of, is it the After Academy? And I think Stephen Colker, he's a huge advocate for mental health as well, and I think he has Behind the White Lines. And again, he talks honestly and openly about his journey with mental health issues as well. But I think, again, it's an ongoing issue, and I think it's just going to grow bigger as well. So again, thank you so much for your presentation. And I suppose it leads us very nicely to our next panel discussion. Our next panel discussion as well. So I'd like to bring up Professor Vincent Gubarch for our next panel.
Good afternoon, everyone, and great to have this introduction about mental health. Thanks, Samantha. Thanks, Michael. Obviously, mental health has been on the agenda in the general population, but also in elite sports since many years. FIFPRO has been working on the mental health of current and retired players. Since 2013, we have taken numerous initiatives in order to put mental health on the agenda, and what we see is that other stakeholders are following our example. And today we have a great panel in order to look at the particular relationship between extreme workload and mental health of the player, the cognitive health of the player, the life balance that they might struggle with during a season and during a whole career. So today we have three great panelists to talk about this particular dimension of mental health with regard to workload, and I'm going to introduce them. The first one is Maeta Molango, the CEO from the PFE. Yes, take floors. Nice to have you. The second one is Nicolas Mayer, who is the performance manager of Paris Saint-Germain. Nice to have you. And last but not least, we have Amit Altintop, of course, former player and involved nowadays at the Turkish FA. Nice to have you. Take a place where you want. You can sit here. I'm going to sit there. And obviously, my role is quite easy today. I'm just going to open the floor with some questions. And I'm going to start with our local guest and former player, Amit. As mentioned by David, you have had a very long-lasting career, 17, 18 years on elite professional football. How did you manage this balance between the club environment, friends, family, mental health? How did you do that for 17, 18 years on the top level?
First of all, nice to having you here, guys. Welcome in Istanbul. I hope it will be a great weekend and we can enjoy the football really with his values and the reality on the top with the wonderful city in Istanbul. To combine this is really a big dream for us, especially finally after 3 years we are preparing this final. I'm enjoying this, and I'm really happy to be here with you guys, especially with you, Alex, and to share my experience and my education last 4 years, especially in the board of the FA. It starts everything with love, and I was strong enough to keep my love in football, to keep my motivation really high. I was really always focusing on the pitch. I was really always fighting to keep my performance on the top. And I think I understood Leahy really early. I was always fighting with myself. I was in challenging with myself and not with the media, or not with my teammates or with the club. I was always trying to do my best, and this was the key for me to stay always healthy and happy with myself. You know, this was the key position, but now it's challenging more higher with the social media and with the pressure in the club or with the agents. Sometimes they are not really educated. They are not really involved in this business, and they don't know really the soul about the football. Because now if you have a good network, nobody cares about the values about football. If you have a good network, they are not care about the mental situation, because they are not really educated, or they are not coming really from the fundamental from the football, you know. And that's why we are in the responsibility to put more ex-footballers in this business, in this transition, to have them here and to take his experience and to sharing this with the new generation, with the youth team especially.
Sounds very good to have more former players involved in the industry. Obviously, we are all agree about that. But
on the right position, right position, this is important. I think, thank you for the presentation before. I think it's a great topic. It's a really great topic, but we have to talk about the solutions. What is the solutions about this topic? And again, more educated people around the player, around the team. I think this is a responsibility from the board, from the president, especially from the FAs or from the clubs, to bring more educated people or advise them in the right direction. I miss this. If you take maybe Bayern Munich, it's maybe not a good example at that time, but this was a good example to have ex-players like Hasan Salihamidzic or Oliver Kahn. They can understand the players more because they share this same problems, same way, same past history, if you check this. And we have to do this one on the top more, but combined with a good education. I think the ex-players, they're missing a little bit this part. How is the work with the stakeholders around, with the broadcaster, with the marketing, with the media, how is the regulation, what is IFAB, what is UEFA, what is really FIFA, you know? And that's why I did my education program by the UEFA MIP team. This is the Executive Masters Program for international player, to understand what happens around the pitch. This helps me a lot to have my easily transition to the board from the Turkish FA.
Great. And obviously, when it comes to player welfare, mental health, and education, I think the PFI has been a key actor worldwide to show how work can be done. Maheta, You have been focusing on that with the organization in England, in a market where they are exposed to a very high workload. How did you facilitate such a support for your players?
It's a good question. Let me start by I think echoing what Amit has just said. I think it's great to have our Turkish friend hosting us today, and we're delighted to be here. I think it's really something that we want to. We made a point of being here today because we wanted to show that support, and I think you do well in putting the spotlight on that. The second thing that I really liked about what you said, Amit, is I think right now you have too many important positions in football held by people who just don't care about the actual game, don't understand the actual game, and make decisions from a perspective that does not reflect what the game needs to evolve and to continue being exciting for the fans. And I think what you say that we need more former players, I think you're right. But at the same time, as you said, it's not enough to say I've played 400 games, but rather I played 400 games plus I have a solid education, then you're unbeatable in the marketplace. And I think you're a good example of that. So I think it's fantastic for us to have you here today to show that example for the players as well. Going back to the question that you're asking, Vincent, I think when I go around every summer to every dressing room in the Premier League just to introduce myself again and to tell them about the PFA, I think the recurrent topic is we play too many games. But it's interesting because I think those are smart people who say, I understand I'm privileged. So it's nice to hear them saying, I'm privileged, I know that I'm doing what I love, yet I'm playing too many games. No? And this is then impacting on my ability to deliver the highest level. I want to play every game. So sometimes what you find is you need to protect the players against themselves, because if it's all for them, they would play every game they want to play. We want to play, right? But the reality is that there's a problem in terms of mental well-being and fatigue, but also we are harming the actual game.
In terms of performance on the field.
So even for the people who only think about that from a commercial perspective, the reality is that the show that we see on the pitch is not at the level it should be, because people are not at the highest level. They manage the game because they know that they've got another game coming up on Saturday. So I think from our perspective, we think that mental well-being is a big thing. We've seen how a lot of people speak up. It's a generation of people who are happy to speak up and to talk about that. And we feel that as a union, what we should be is a safe, independent space to talk about it. Because a lot of time as a player, you don't want to go and talk to the psychologist of the team because you're thinking, okay, where this information will end up? Will it go to the manager, which a lot of time happens? It goes back to the coach, and then what impact will have on me playing on Saturday or not? Or to the club, and have an impact in terms of my contract being extended or not. No? So we feel that the role of a union is being this independent, non-conflicted place where a player can come and open up and speak openly about whatever issue he or she, in our case, because we represent both male and female players, may have.
Yeah, and Nicolas, obviously you are working in a very high performance context with Paris Saint-Germain, and generally we associate the mat congestion problem, with the number of game plays, of the number of recovery days. But I think there is another dimension that we need to touch and discuss, is travel. Travel is obviously a huge thing for those teams, big impact on sleep quality and sleep quantity. And I think as a high-performance club, you need to manage that properly. How is your experience by Paris Saint-Germain recently?
No, offshore it's a big issue for us, for one main reason, because most of our game, we play most of our game at 9 o'clock in the evening, most of our games. It means 90% of your time you came late at home, and when you play away, it's always you are not at home before 3 or 4. And after, when you are in a congested period, of course, day plus one after a game, you need to train, because you have to prepare. It's day minus 2 before next game, or day minus 3, because as you present, Michael, we club playing Champions League or Europa League or international European competition, they are involved in a lot of competition. It means they are playing a lot of back-to-back games. And for us, it's a big issue. We struggle to find strategies or to find the best, try to suggest to the players best options we can provide. But of course, it's not easy, because you miss quality of sleep, because even when you go at bed every 3 days at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock, plus the stress of the game, because you're at home at 3 or 4, but you are already you are stressed from the game, because we cannot really measure the stress behind each game for each player. And for us, it's a big issue. And of course, we suffer a lot about this not this planification, but playing all the time really late. It's a big disadvantage in my point of view, for example.
Yeah, I can imagine that. And not surprisingly, if you look at the medical data, 1 out of 2 elite athletes, including professional football, is suffering from sleep disturbance. So obviously, travel, jet lag is something that contributes to this sleep disturbance.
And if I can add, we are in a way to think that now in July we'll open a new training center in Paris, and we'll have a special room, trying to have with some tools around on the topic of sleep and mental recovery.
Yeah.
Donc more neuromental of the, how you can say in
neuropsychological fatigue.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. One piece of the building will be focused on this area, on the same floor you can find the room of the players.
Yeah.
Donc it means for us it's really a huge topic.
Yeah, I can imagine it will become even more challenging with the number of games that is only increasing, the number of new competition. What is your view on that? How are we going to define a balanced match calendar between domestic, international competition? I mean, we're having this event today, not for nothing, because we haven't been successful yet. Do you see any avenue positively in the future for that?
I think that the big problem that you have is that each of the people who organize competition see this in isolation. So you talk to FIFA and they say to you, well, our calendars actually fit, and it does fit if you only look at this in isolation.
Yeah.
But then you look at the commitment of the club, and yes, it does fit, but only in isolation. Then you look at UEFA and it's the same. And it's difficult. To give you an example, we wanted to invite 2 players who are currently playing right now to this event. And the reality that this specific guy who plays for Tottenham, he finished playing on the 28th of May. He had like approximately a week off to go somewhere. On Monday, he needs to come back for England duty.
Yeah.
But to be able to play on Monday, you cannot be off 2 weeks, because otherwise you're not able to play on that Monday. So you need to continue training somehow, so you don't stop.
Yeah.
You go on England duty to play in June, which is difficult for us to comprehend, but they do. And then you finish by, I think, the 20th. But then within 2 weeks, you need to go on training camp, but not in Brighton. You go to Asia, you go to Australia, so you're thinking, so the guy has just played like, 70 or whatever number of games. Mm-hmm. He's going to have, a week maybe of vacation somehow, and then you start again.
Yeah.
So the problem that we see is that we need to find a solution where we stop looking at this in isolation, but rather globally. And for us, the key point should be, you don't put a calendar and then ask the players, can you play that? Or rather do that. You look at what is the maximum number of games that they can play, and then from there, you build the calendar. So I think we're starting from the wrong end, the discussion around that.
And coordination
and
communication between stakeholders and competition organizers.
But also I think what some of those stakeholders have not understood is that it was unthinkable for someone like Varane to say, I'm 29, I stopped playing maybe a few years ago because you wanted to play. But nowadays, the way they look at the world, their values are different from mine, or maybe Amit. They put their personal life sometime above the professional situation. I think if we're not careful, a lot of them will say, you know what, I will not play. Mm-hmm. And then if we lose a Varane, we lose quality. If we lose quality, we lose fans. And then it's a dangerous spiral, mm-hmm. I think.
Yeah. So nowadays at Paris Saint-Germain, they do a lot of work towards mental recovery and mental regeneration after a match and after a season. In your time as a player, Amit, was it already existing, or it's something that you saw coming through the years of your careers?
Yeah, I think now you have to manage more individual players, you know what I mean? You have to go specific in the player, and in my time we had one shuttle and everyone have to follow this. And now if you see the trainings program in the athletic part, they are all specific and different. You have the different of the types from the physical side, you know, and this is a key point to lead the player in the right way. The game is the motivation. If you have fun, if you have this feeling, I am in good shape, it's a performance much higher. But now we are talking too much about the money. We are talking too much about the pressure and the stakeholders, and you know, we miss how it starts. Huh? It was fun, it was love, and now it's more too much. Data's really important, but not important than the good feeling. You know what I mean? And the motivation. That's why I'm talking about the pedagogic side. You know, we need more educated people to understand the players about his efforts and how about the feeling and the relation with the family, with the friends, you know, to have the right balance. And we are talking about success, but how you get the success?
Yeah.
Always with pushing, or sometimes to take a break, you know?
Well, we know how recovery and regeneration is
and
important.
This is responsibility from the player and from the club.
Yeah.
Maybe you need a bigger squads, you know. I mean, more players to have the right balance, you know.
Yeah. That might be one solution. And obviously, you spoke about those.
Maybe less games, more performance, you know.
Yeah.
I can't understand if you have 25 players, one of them he's playing 10,000 minutes and the other one is only playing 500 minutes. End of the day, one guy is happy and the other one is not happy, but they're in the same team. This is not working.
No, it's a challenging situation indeed. And you spoke about those specific programs that were developed and that you saw during your career. Nicolas, obviously you see a lot of high-profile elite professional footballer in Paris Saint-Germain, and it is kind of struggle to work with their own team, because all these players, they have their own external team next to the team of Paris Saint-Germain. How do you deal with that in order to manage their workload from a physical, physiological, and mental perspective?
No, you can be sure it's really easy, because during season 90% of the squad is completely focused on the process of the club. Okay, when you have to deal with this, it's more during time off. Now you have 2 weeks off. The player is not international. 3 weeks off. The player is not international. Now you have to be in contact with the team, of the coach, of the player, to organize a bit. We have the case now, but for an international player, we don't have this kind of problem, because most of the team is following the main part of the programs, what we set up, and of course you have some. You will, with the player who plays, you don't have this kind of problems. It's more the players who are not playing. Like you were saying, a player who is playing every 3 days, it's not only. It's about management, recovery. It's more about these 2 areas. But the player who is not playing, now young generation who is coming, young players, environment a bit different. This is a bit more touchy. And I will say on this kind of profile, it's a bit harder to manage. Okay. It's more the 15-20% of the difficulty. because getting them fit without playing. But
Yeah.
you are in an environment where you play with all maybe 14 of your players plays almost all minutes. But what do you do with the 5, 6 other? And that's of course we struggle with this. Like I guess a lot of squad in Europe.
Every club is struggling with that, indeed. In the audience, we also have Giovanni Di Cola, who is head of the regional office of the International Labour Organization. Nice to have you. And I know that recently the World Health Organization, together with the International Labour Organization, took action in order to promote and protect the mental health of the general population and employees across all industries. And I was wondering if you could perhaps elaborate on which action has been defined and taken recently when it comes specifically to mental health.
First of all, thanks for inviting me. I am actually in charge of the office for Turkey for the moment, not of the regional office. And
My mistake.
I've been a low focal point for sport for many, many years. But yes, we did an MOU with the WHO on the issue of mental health. And basically it's about protecting, protecting, and of course support to the workers. In this case, it would be the players. But there is one point which has been mentioned by all of you, which is basically the creating an enabling environment, which was made the point by the president of FIFPRO Europe. It was made the point by Maïta Molango. The issue is, and you can see also from other intervention, that the environment is fragmented. Normally, sport should be a value chain, and therefore you have a view on the value chain which is more holistic. And then you see that because of the fragmentation, basically, you don't control what is next to the other. So you don't control the number of games. You said yourself, you know, if we increase performance, perhaps you should have less number of games. Or if you increase the number of players, then the balance could be that, everyone has the chance to play, and therefore those who are on the hotspot playing relatively less. And I think that's something that you see the importance of a study like this. It's evidence-based. I congratulate those who have done the study because it's quality-oriented, and then it gives a real insight of what is happening. I wonder if in order to, because we can implement MOUs at the international level, but the issue is how do you implement at the national level? How do you make sure, for example, that OSH, Occupational Safety and Health, is implemented at the level of France, at the level of Turkey, at the level of UK and elsewhere? So the issue is not only how we use an MOU at the international level, but how you implement practically. You have one advantage is you have representation of players, which is not happening elsewhere in other sports. The second advantage is that the society is pressing to make sure that those issues about ethics, work qualities, reducing risks and accidents are actually taken into consideration. My last point is about the cost. And the cost is two ways. It can be an incentive, and it can be actually a problem for the clubs. If we look only from the club responsibility, I think we are wrong, because the issue of cost of injuries and fatalities, and not fatalities, but basically injuries for the players, is extremely high. Not only for the players themselves, but for the families, for the community, for the social protection system, for the insurances, and therefore for the clubs as well. So I think we have to make sure that we could have a conversation with those in a way which is more holistic, as you said, President. And I think that this study can make a real difference. The other one is what is the cost? And perhaps this is where we could help.
Yeah. Obviously, we have a couple of studies that have calculated the cost of injury, especially in the Premier League, and it's quite substantial indeed. And with regard to the challenge of implementation on domestic level, what is the challenge that you are facing nowadays when it comes to the workload, engaging with the Premier League and the clubs who have all these commercial trips during the preparation phase? How challenging is that?
I think the biggest problem is that ultimately when you talk to the Premier League, they say to you, we actually do respect the whatever number of weeks they need to be off. is not due to our competition that your players are playing. It's due to the fact that there's no coordination between what we do and what others do.
Yeah.
So that's one of the biggest challenges. I think going back to the point that was made, which I think was very interesting, what I found myself transitioning from playing to having a normal work is that sometimes you talk to people and say to you, well, but why do they complain? I mean, I travel a lot as well as in my business life. Yeah, but when you travel, you're not asked to then run 12 kilometers at that intensity. It's just, I mean, I don't want to undermine what I've been doing since I was playing, but the reality is that in your normal life, if you have a bad day, you manage, even a week, you kind of manage. Here, you cannot manage as a player because you're supposed to be there.
You cannot hide. You cannot hide. No.
And need to. So it's not just, I come from Prague, I come here, I can talk, but they need to play at a certain level. So the concept of a working day is just different than a normal one. And sometimes you're in a room talking to people who are like, why do you complain? I mean, they make a lot of money, they should be able to, yeah, but it's a different type of effort that you are required to do on the pitch than off the field, no? But going back to the coordination, I think the biggest issue is that from a domestic perspective, they would comply, but then when you add the various competition, they do not.
Yeah.
And that's the biggest struggle that you're having, and hence why we think that it needs to be someone, I would imagine probably FIFA, who needs to be the kind of the parents of football and kind of ensure that this coordination exists and is effectively implemented, because otherwise it's an impossible challenge to solve.
Yeah, obviously, indeed, FIFA has a big role to play, and FIFPRO has been claiming year after year to secure this kind of in and off-season period of recovery physically and mentally, but we are not there yet, unfortunately. With regard to career transition, because you mentioned that, it's obviously very challenging. We know that many retired professional footballers are challenged mentally and physically as well. How did you prepare yourself physically and mentally for that transitioning period? Did you have a particular secret? Education is obviously a key word for you, so that might be the secret of the success.
You mean in the past as player, or?
Yeah, from player not to be a player, transitioning out of football when you retired.
I had a really tough time. I had really serious injuries. This did my transition more easily because I had periods I was only like a spectator, you know. I was close to the team, but I didn't play because my injuries. That's why was my transition really clear because the issues in the Turkey football, I was really clear what can be my role. My role is to push the new generation in the right direction. This was my dream, and now I'm in the good position, in the right position to convince or influence the new generation with my experience, with a good example in the European football, like in Germany. I'm educated from Germany. This is my plus. That's why was my transition not so difficult, because I'm not liking looking back and crying and saying, hey, this was a good opportunity and like this. I'm looking forward, and that's why it was easy. It was easy, really easy, and I'm lucky too to have this position now in the Turkish FA. That's why it was not so difficult. But if I'm talking with my colleagues or my ex-teammates, they are sometimes not clear to say I will be the head coach, I will join to the media group, or I will do nothing. They are not really clear. That's why it's a role from the agent really important. They are not really care about the footballers. They are not listen to the footballer, or they are not ready to stay with them after their career, you know.
And there is a big role for the union to guide the player, obviously, through this period. Coming back to the...
But sorry, that's why it's really important to choose a good club. If you have the right club and there are good people around the club, they will support you always.
Yeah.
They will share the problems with you, maybe, you know, or they can advise you by the next step. That's why we have to take the responsibility and to stay in this business.
Yeah.
Not only on the top. I think the fundamental areas at the bottom, it's important too, you know. But many people now, they're only looking on the top, and they want on the picture. But this is not the goal for me. For me, is to have the healthy football family with all stakeholders. You know what I mean? This is very important, and this is really tough to convince people, especially the big stakeholders like the broadcaster or the main sponsors. But end of the day, you have to be strong. You have to be strong, like always.
When it
Like
comes to
always.
workload, you need to be
Like
strong.
always, you know.
Yeah. And when it comes to workload, coming back to that topic of the panel today, Nicola, obviously your role as a performance manager has evolved through the year. Can you perhaps provide the audience with some key practical things that changed through the year when it comes to managing the workload and the recovery of player? Because now new technologies have been implemented. So can you provide us with some insight about that?
Of course, in the business, I guess there is with a lot of back-to-back games, there is no, I would say, something fixed, but it's always a balance in between recovery and work. And of course, according to the staff, the methodology you have, I guess sometimes it could be dangerous to take a position only to recover. And it's behind all these games, there is a performance, I would say, a big performance topic. It's about how can we really work? Because if you want to get fit all year, you need to work, not only to recover. Donc, behind this strategy, if you take this into account, what is the best to work? After you go to another topic is what's about the planning. It means if you go into the planning, you say, okay, when you have a lot of back-to-back games, you need to take a seat with the head coach to say, okay, what is the schedule what is the best schedule we can do? If we flight, if you came back at 4 o'clock in the evening, during the night, what is the best hour? Try to fix for the player to train. Mm-hmm. Because if you do it too early, it doesn't sleep. Donc you cannot provide a good stimulus for the player. Donc it's always, I will say, what changed. It's planification is a mess. Okay. For me, there is no. It's weekly adaptation to the dynamic of the squad, and I guess more the time is running, more games we are playing, more we need to be flexible and adaptable. And you find another third topic that you expressed is, for me, we are not so far to be like in NBA, like in basketball. We are collective sports with 11 players, but you have individual strategies. Whereas the workload you provide with a lot of key findings, really interesting, but into this workload data, according to the position or the position of the player, according to the profile of the player, the age, you have different outputs and this leads you to more individualization of maybe the training, of recovery strategies, of planification, but maintaining a collective as a purpose, because at the end, it's a collective sport. And that's, for me, the huge part, the most difficult part, how you can maintain a collective balance with some key principles, but also taking into account the necessity of individualization. Yeah. And this is more actually complex in 2023.
It's
than
a
before.
reality.
Yeah. Okay. So,
Can I ask in this case something? If you make a schedule for one player, I mean, with the rehabilitation, with the recovery, and then with the adaptation, and then with the preparing for the game, are you in this way can you teach him? Can you explain him why you do this one? Because in my time, it was, hey, 9 a.m. in the locker room, 10 a.m. is training, and then 1 p.m. is lunch, and then you can go home. But nobody is explaining why I do this training, why I make this rehabilitation or this recovery, why I improving in this way and not in this way. You know, I miss this one little bit. The players like, hey, you have to come, you have to this one because you get this money and this salary. This is nobody can enjoy this one. You know, only players their mentality strong. You know what I mean? Like Cristiano maybe, or like Messi, their mentality really strict and strong. You know what I mean? They have a big dreams. They have a big idols like Maradona, or like they want to beat everyone. You know, but you have only 3-4 of them, and the other, they're maybe not so strong. You know, and we are not ready to teach them, to take a time and say, hey, players, this is a process, this is the past, this is history, and this is the next, you know, because they're always blaming, but they have, to the other people, they have maybe 10 or 12 hours rest per day. What they are doing that time? Nothing. Always relaxing, always social media, and then good lunch or the dinner, you know, or spend the time with the girlfriend like this. This is not enough. If you give them so much money as club, you have to teach them maybe, you know.
Educate.
And they have to take this time and have to respect this way. If PSG say, hey, this is a salary for you, 5 million per year, but this is a schedule for you, with the education, with the training, with the food, and like this, you know.
Well,
and after this career, he's maybe educated in the transition. It's more easy to implement this guy in this business. Because everyone knows,
it's okay.
Everyone knows after the player careers, they're getting down, have the mentality problems, they lost his money, you know, have the psychological problems, you know what I mean? But the club has to take more responsibility for the players too. Not only the player and the agent, because we are talking from a guy, he's 20 years old. He don't know what happened in the world.
I think it's a great take-home message for you, Nicolas, to bring back to Paris Saint-Germain.
Sorry. My question was, are you teaching why you do this program, you know, in both ways, with the rehabilitation, with the recovery, and with the preparing for the game?
For sure, trying to make it short. What is sure is now you have to involve the player into the process. In terms with new generation, especially with new generation, now it's an obligation to have pedagogy and trying to learn, to teach them and teach them setting goals together, trying to set up some basics like how the preparation before breakfast principles, physio preparation, pre-activation strategies, after post-training prevention, after doing recovery strategies, after as you spoke about it, afternoon. What do you do from your afternoon? School, or maybe can do some extra work with an extra physio. It's an obligation if you want to set up an autonomy of the player in 5-6 years, it's necessary to be in interaction with the player. If not, you will never provide autonomy with the player, because now it's too complex. The player is always, as you say, a young player now is often on his phone. His agent environment is something really complex around him. It means when I completely agree with you, it's responsibility of the club when it comes to trying to teach trying to teach him. Even sometimes it's tough, because when he's not playing, you have to tell him the truth, or tell him that sometimes to go to a goal, you need to use different way, but keeping the vision of what he needs to trying to build the best career we can. And I completely agree with you, because when I arrived in 2014 in Paris, the squad, we had a lot of guys who were 30 years old, with like Ibrahimovic, Mota, Maxwell. We have a lot, Thiago Silva, a lot of players. And it was for me a lesson to see them work, because everything was set up. Nothing, you had nothing to say. I was saying, I never expected it was so easy to work with them. But now you see the difference.
With the
one is leaving, the second is leaving, the third is leaving, the fourth is leaving, and after, boop, you drop to 20 years, 25 years players. It's not the same process. And it means you, a messenger, to say, okay, now let's fight every day, trying to teach something. Because at the end, our goal is not only for the club, but it's also for the career of the player. And it's a real topic here.
So we are almost at the coffee break, running out of time. Final question for a short answer to you, Marita. The increasing number of minute play by the young player before 20, if you compare the generation back in our years and compared to the new generation, how alarming is that?
Well, I think it's worrying, because I think if the average career, I think, is 8 or 9 years, at that pace you're going to have much less than that. So I think our discussion with the authorities is, if this is a fact, how are you going to try to find ways to compensate that? How are we going to find a way to somehow compensate for that? And I think it makes our discussion to players even easier.
Yeah.
Because when they see that, it's very clear, and they understand data better than I did. At this pace, Jude Bellingham, I mean, I would be surprised if he plays 10 years at that level. It's just not sustainable. It's pretty clear. We're very concerned about that.
Yeah, we'll see how we can manage the increasing number of match and minutes played by the young generation. I think we are almost at the coffee break, Samantha, isn't it?
Yes, we're almost at the coffee break. But first of all, I just want to say thank you so much for that refreshing and in-depth discussion. I think everybody in this room really appreciates you and your honesty. Hamid, you're on a mission. We can see it. And I think a lot of people back you. But I do want to open up the floor for a couple of Q&As. So does anyone want to ask a panelist a question very quickly? We'll have probably 2 questions. Anybody?
Anyone?
This is your last chance. No one wants to? Okay. Oh, okay.
Hi. I can ask a question. In here, Mr. Hamid Altentop, he told about the educational stuff, about the footballers, how to learn the stuff about how to run their money, how to keep their mental health on the form, etc., etc. When is the best time to start to do this education? I mean, in academy-wise, when do we need to start this process? How do we interact with the kids? What is your opinion about this? Thank you.
Good question. Thank you. I think you have to start in the primary school. Because if you see, especially in Turkey, everybody talking about football, but without knowledge. But if you start this one in the primary school, maybe 1-2 hours, and you start with your child this one, and at the dinner time, if you're talking about football, about rules, about the games, and then it's starting to say, hey, Daddy, I want to play in the club. And then it's the next step to have the school and the first club, and if you have the good cooperation together, education and the football club, you know, and then this is for the business good too. And then they have a family trip to the games, and they're buying equipment, shirts, and then they want to go to the away game, you know what I mean? But with the right knowledge. This is really important. If you're talking about football, they have to know the regulations, the rules. We're missing this in Turkey. I'm so sad about this. That's why I'm fighting to have a good cooperation with the education programs, you know, to put this in the primary school. Because we have to convince the generation for us, you know what I mean? To convince them and to work together with them. This is the main goal. Sounds difficult, but it's not so difficult, trust me. We have a great projects, and I'm really positive for the future.
Any other questions? We'll have one more. Oh.
Hamid, thank you for sharing your experience as a player. I think you made a very valid point that to get the best out of an athlete, you need to keep them happy, they need to enjoy the game, and so on. However, we're seeing across the board that many clubs are realising that the player is a worker, whether it's putting conditions in place to have them having a better sleeping pattern, all of this. And the fragmentation, national teams and FAs will ask the athlete to represent their country because their love of the game, it's the right thing to do, whereas the clubs understand that it's work for the most part. How do we ensure this balance, that the player is treated as a worker, not only when they're at their club, but also with the national team? Because I do understand, being a former international, that you do play for your country and you play for the badge. But it is work. What you do there can impact whether you play the next month for your club. If you don't play the next month for your club, and I'll talk for PSG, if you miss 4 weeks there is every chance you're not getting that spot back in the team because they're continuously winning. So how do we find that balance when we talk about educating players, but also the cultural element from the national team setups?
It's a good topic, it's a good point. But let's talk about the good examples. If you see the World Cup with Argentina and with Enzo, after this World Cup, he joined to Chelsea with this amazing transfer fee, you know what I mean? And if you're talking about values, if you're talking about human being, it's a national team really, really important to stay by your roots, you know, and as FA and the players, if you are on the focus, you have again big responsibility for the next generation. You have to like idol, you know what I mean? Like that's why it's the national team in this context really, really important. For us, this is good. We are responsible for all leagues, and we can decide how we can manage this and handle this. And of course, we have to protect the players and the clubs and especially the rights from the broadcaster and the sponsors too. But in this case, we need more educated people. If we expecting so much with people that are not educated, with not enough knowledge, it's really difficult to manage this position. I mean, this business.
Can I just add something to what you said? I think it's a very good question. And what we are seeing, and I think one of the big battles that we're having right now, and we achieved a big result with the women's football, was that you had situations where I think sometimes some of the federation were taking advantage of the fact that the players were playing for the badge, but the reality that this was generating money here. And I think what we saw is that, in a way, the players were playing for the badge and the pride of playing for the national team, but you had a lot of federations who were making money out of that without forcibly redistributing the money as it should be. And I think one of the big fights that we had recently is to try to ensure that whatever is paid as a prize money is then distributed, fairly to the guys who generate the show, no? As opposed to maybe staying in a situation where we don't know exactly where the money is going. And I think the good news about that is having more people like you on those key positions at federation to share that view of saying, hold on, guys, this is ultimately the result of the work of people who are here for the pride, but they're also not spending time with the people who actually pay them every month, no? So I think it's a very good question, and I think from our perspective, having more people like you in those positions hopefully will change the mentality and make it easier for us to have those conversations with the federations.
And I think this is a good time to end the first half. Right now, we will have a 20-minute break, so please get your refreshments outside. And again, thank you so much for this panel. I think we learned a lot from you guys. Thank you so much. Yeah. I hope everybody enjoyed that break. You'll have another opportunity to network afterwards as well. But I think we're good to start. Yes, you're late. Of course you are. Okay, so I'm going to start for everybody. Is that okay? Great. Okay, so welcome back. I really hope you enjoyed the first half of this forum, because the second half, we are going to talk about the money. We are going to delve deep inside the financials, and in particular, financial sustainability. And, oh, there is no way you are walking off right now. Okay, yes, he is. I have to introduce him. But yes, for that, I am pleased to welcome Andrea Sartori, the founder and CEO of Football Benchmark and former global head of sports at KPMG, to give us the detailed picture and the status quo. So, Andreas, before you were running off on me, it is over to you.
Thank you, Samantha. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Yes, I'm Andrea Sartori. I'm the founder and CEO of Football Benchmark, that was for many years part of KPMG. And we spun off on the 1st of April of last year. And today we are presenting the 8th edition of our football club valuation report, where we measure the enterprise value of the top 32 European clubs. I'm joined today by two very distinguished guests. So I'm now welcoming Andrea Traverso from UEFA, who is the Financial Sustainability and Research Director. Please, Andrea. Thank you. And our second guest is our good friend, Director of Global Policy and Strategic Relationship at FIFPRO, Alexander Bielfeld. So I'm going to start with a relatively brief presentation. Please feel free to interrupt me anytime if you would like to ask questions. As I say, this is the edition of our report where we measure the enterprise value of a football club. What is actually enterprise value? In a very simplified term, is basically the value of all the assets that a club owns. But if we want to be a little bit more technical, it's actually shareholder equity plus total debt minus cash that is at disposal of a club. Why do we take enterprise value rather than equity value to measure the value of a club? The reason is that enterprise value is a capital neutral type of metrics. Therefore, it allows us to compare clubs with a different debt equity structure. How do we actually measure the enterprise value of a club? The most traditional way of valuing company, which is the discounted cash flow methodology, is most of the time, I would say, not applicable to football club, because very often clubs, they have negative profits. So they're making loss. They have a negative EBITDA. And that's why it's very, very complex. There is the net asset valuation approach, which is a method that we often apply when we are engaged by football club to measure basically their value. But the approach that we have developed, the algorithm that we have developed, is a revenue multiple approach. So we have looked at a history of transaction, and we have basically established a multiple that is related to the revenue. So the value vis-a-vis the revenue that the club generates. But that would be a too simplistic approach, because how you would take into account a club with a very strong asset position, how you would take into account a club that is making loss vis-a-vis a club that is making profit. What we have developed is a so-called adjusted revenue multiple. So we look at the past transaction, we take a base multiple, and then we adjust, taking into account the following aspects: the profitability of a club, particularly the EBIT level and the squad, the salary wage vis-à-vis the revenue. The sporting potential of a club, which is an asset measure. So what is the value of the squad, which basically express, to a certain extent, the sporting potential of a club. If you have a club with high-value player, you have better chances to actually win on pitch. But that's also measured in a way your asset position. Whether or not a club owns the stadium, the size of the broadcasting market in which the club actually play, and the popularity of a club. And we use popularity looking at social media followership and social media engagement, which is a sort of an expression of the brand value of a club. How do we actually select the clubs that are part of our ranking? Of course, we need to have financial statements available, and actually some clubs, for example, Wolfsburg, does not actually publish their own individual club financial statement. And that's why we were never able to assess them. The club have to be both in the top 50 by revenue or in the top 50 by UEFA coefficient. The other way to get into the ranking is to be top 30 by social media followers. So these are the criteria based on which we are actually selecting the clubs. If we look at this year, 32 clubs, we can see a growing dominance of the EPL. So the EPL now has 11 clubs represented. When we did this study the very first time in 2016, the total number of clubs from the EPL was only 7 or 8, I cannot actually remember. Italy is the second most represented country with 7 clubs. Spain has 5 clubs. Valencia was actually part last year, but basically got out from the top 32. We have 3 German clubs, so Bayern Munich, Borussia Dortmund, and Eintracht Frankfurt. And we have 3 French clubs. We don't have any more Monaco since a while, and we have Olympique Lyon, Marseille, and PSG. What is very interesting is that 29 out of the 32 top clubs by enterprise value, they play in the Big Five. We only have 3 clubs that are outside of the Big Five: Porto, Benfica, and Ajax. What is also interesting, and in a way sad, because we are in Turkey, we don't have anymore a Turkish club. In our report of 2017, we had 3 Turkish clubs, but we will get back to this point. If we look at the key findings in terms of the valuation of the report, what is very important to notice is the very, very strong growth of enterprise value. Of course, the industry was devastated by COVID. A lot of revenue were basically wiped out, and profitability, of course, was significantly impacted, but the industry is slowly recovering. And if we compare the enterprise value to the first year or the last season not impacted by COVID, the growth is 30%, so from the 39.7 billion to 51.7 billion of last year, a growth of 40% in comparison to last year, still impacted by COVID. And if we look the 7 years covered by our 8th edition, the value of the clubs have actually doubled. There are very, very few sectors on the stock exchange, in different stock exchange, in different markets, that they can basically double their value within this time frame. You should bear that into account. If we look at the value, that 51 plus billion, and we see how it is distributed between the different countries, we can see that the Premier League with 11 clubs make 45% of the total. What is also interesting to see is that Italy with 7 clubs make exactly the same value or very similar value like the Bundesliga, so 12.3% vis-à-vis 12.1. Spain with 5 clubs make approximately 20% of the total. And I think what is actually quite astonishing is that the 3 clubs that are playing outside of the Big Five, so the 2 Portuguese clubs plus Ajax, they only make 3% of the total. And again, all of this in a way showcase the strength of the big five market, which we should never forget are the five biggest economy, the most populated economy with a relatively high GDP, not necessarily the highest GDP per capita, but in absolute term, of course, the five countries with the highest level of inhabitants as well as GDP. If we look at the value, for the first time ever, we have two clubs that passed the 4 billion euro value. At the top of the podium for this year, we have Manchester City. Last year it was in 6th position, but their level of revenue, their level of profitability, the squad value, the exposure that they are having with their branding, which we measure again through social media performance, has brought them at the top of this ranking. After 4 years being at the top, Real Madrid is second, although the difference is approximately 70 million euros, so a very reduced one. And Manchester United is actually completing this podium. And again, the difference between Manchester United and Manchester City is relatively limited. And this concentration of value at the top, this is the rank of the top 10, and the value is expressed by the light blue number. So again, for Manchester United, the 4.73 that we can see there. What is interesting to see is that the difference between the first rank and the 5th rank being Bayern Munich, it's relatively limited, less than 250 million euro. And to me, that when we were writing this report, when we were doing this analysis, we basically came to the conclusion that this top club, that very, very rarely they come on the market, and many of these clubs you cannot even buy because of their governance and their corporate structure. Think, for example, Barcelona and Real Madrid. They could not be transacted like it has happened with Chelsea and potentially might happen with Manchester United. But those clubs at the very, very top are very, very rare. But because their value is so close, I would almost call them sort of substitutive products, so products that you can, in a way, replace. I use this example. It's like when you want to buy a car, whether you choose between a BMW, an Audi, and a Mercedes. They are very much at the top end of the market. But if you cannot buy one, you would probably buy the other. And the best example of this is the decision of Jim Ratcliffe to bid for Chelsea several months ago, and then bidding for Manchester United, which, by the way, is his beloved club since his young age, and trying to buy a club at the very top end of the market, simply because there are very, very few opportunities of buying this type of club. Looking at the evolution, again, Manchester City went up 5 positions. Barcelona is the club that has lost most position. It's down by 3 positions. Liverpool has moved up by 1 position. Arsenal is back in the top 10. Juventus used to be the only Italian club in the top 10. Now is actually 12. The 11th club is actually at Atletico Madrid. So all in all, this is an evolution of the top 10 ranking. What is also interesting to see is the double-digit growth for all the top 10 clubs. If you look, Manchester City has grown by 64% in value. The club that has grown the least is Barcelona. They lost still 3 positions, but their value has still grown by 25%. And now the question to all of you is why values are growing? What is driving this growth of value? And what I'm saying is the whole sector is actually growing. And why the whole sector is growing? Because the multiple of recent transactions that has taken place has actually grown. If we look at, this is the enterprise value estimated at which a transaction took place. So if you look at this value, Chelsea was transacted at approximately 5 times their revenue. AC Milan and Olympique Lyon between 425 and 475. Other clubs that are listed here, Hertha Berlin, Newcastle, Atalanta, they are in the range of 3 plus. So those multiple, in comparison to past year, have grown. So we had to grow the multiple of the entire sector. But why these multiple are growing? First of all, because the revenue are growing. So in comparison to last year, they grown by 15%. I want to underline that when we are doing our calculation, we look at the past 3 years. So we don't take a single year. The overall improved profitability of club, in comparison to last year, losses have improved by approximately 1 billion. So we are still in red for the top 32 clubs, but with less losses of 1 billion in comparison. Then I would say that there are 2 very important factors that are influencing the transaction price. One is the new UEFA Club Licensing and Financial Sustainability Regulation, and we will speak about it with Andrea Traverso, because they are going to bring further stability to football club, increasing their profitability most likely and stabilizing eventually also cash flow. So if you take that into account, especially with the type of investor that are going into the market, institutional investors, for them that stability is what they are looking for. Therefore, in view of this, they are paying higher prices. Last but not least, I think there is the expectation of growing revenue coming either from new competition, like, for example, the FIFA Club World Cup happening in 2025, and 13 clubs in Europe will significantly benefit from that new competition. And then also the changes of the new UEFA Champions League, starting from the season 24-25, and the new cycle where basically revenue are expected to reach 5 billion from the current 3.6 billion. So I will continue with the presentation, but I would like to interrupt to ask a first question to Andrea. Basically, I've presented what is happening in terms of enterprise value, but I think for our audience it would be very important to hear from you how the industry is recovering from the impact of COVID in the past, basically 2 football seasons. Because you see the most updated information. We don't have that luxury. We are basing our analysis on the financial statement of the year 21-22, while Andrea is seeing the number, the most updated number on a quarterly basis, right?
More or less. I think that you have provided a very clear picture as well. So I think that I can only confirm a little bit what you have already told with regard to the enterprise value. So first of all, I would like to thank you all for this invitation. So and thank you for inviting me here to this event. But yes, I mean, in the recent past, I mean, something totally unexpected has hit our industry, has hit the sport, and football had to stop for a long period of time. For that reason, obviously, revenues have been suffering and decreased quite significantly, especially over the years 2020, 1920, 2021. Whereby whereby football basically lost revenues for approximately 7 billion of euros, which is quite a huge amount, knowing that on a yearly basis, football was generating in those years around 21 billion. So losing 3.5 or 4 billion a year is quite a significant amount. Clubs have suffered because there is no doubt that many of them experienced some liquidity crunches, and therefore they had to try to find some solutions in order to be able to continue to pay also the salaries of the player and to sustain those costs that by nature they are rigid, while revenues are much more volatile. So in which way? Either obviously owners' injections or going to the market and obviously requesting, borrowing more money from the banks, and some of them as well has been balked by other typology of investors that were seizing a little bit that opportunity to enter into the market. Now the situation is definitely improving, as you were saying. Pandemic is behind us, so we are little by little we are forgetting about that difficult period.
Stadiums are open, which is an
Stadiums
important
are open,
point.
and especially people are very much willing to go back to the experience. And this is why we have noticed basically high record attendances basically many countries. So it's not just about the top 5, but as well in the other countries we are experiencing really record attendances. So this demonstrated the fact that people wants to go back to life. I mean, and this is clear. So revenues are going back. As you said, profitability is improving. Now, this situation is still serious because 2022 closes again with 3 billion losses, which is a very, okay, it's not a 4 of the previous year, but still we are talking about a level which is quite important. And for 2023, it's still very difficult to have a clear overview because it's still a little bit soon, but we would expect still important losses, obviously decreasing, but still important losses. So I would say that the perspective moving forward look positive, at least from the revenue side. What we are very much concentrating and focusing on with the new regulations, we might then talk about those later, is really about, you know, managing more the cost side, or mainly trying to prevent mismanagement to take place. And this is what we want to finally to have now, a much more prudential management of the cost structure of the clubs.
By the way, you mentioned the new regulation coming to market. I would say that the new squad spending rule and also the equity requirements that club are they have to respect, which was not part of the previous regulation of financial fair play. We have considered those a major driver of growth, of value, and therefore investor willing to pay more for a club. Would you agree with that assumption?
I fully agree with that assumption, because what we are witnessing this in these days is the fact that we have a lot of private investors coming in, private equity investors coming into the game, and among those investors are institutional investors as well. And those, as you rightly said, institutional investors, they look for stability, they look for cost control mechanism in place, because they see that mismanagement could lead to serious issues, and therefore they could put seriously at risk their investment. So introducing those kind of regulations, usually the objective is to attract, I would say, those investors that are looking for a sustainable game. You mentioned the equity rule. I consider that rule probably the most important in the whole new package. It has been a little bit
valued, I would say, underestimated the importance of it. I agree.
Undervalued. Everyone is focusing about the other one, which is the cost management, the squad cost rule, which obviously is important, but to some extent it was already existing before. We are simply narrowing down a little bit, we are making it a little bit more detailed.
Yeah.
But the equity one is very, very important, because, if clubs have a robust balance sheet, then they are in a position to better absorb external crises, so difficult periods. And we have seen it now during the pandemic. So throughout the whole period of the introduction of financial fair play, the equity of football clubs improved significantly, obviously large part of it has been eroded during the pandemic. So by introducing a rules whereby we request clubs either to have positive equity or to improve by 10% every year is quite an important signal, because we want to re-establish a level of equity which is sound and sufficient to cope with crisis.
Alexander, we spoke about the squad spending rule, and also for the people that are listening to us from home or from their office in streaming, let's remind what it is, where basically is a cost measure where there is control on the spending on salaries, player agents, and amortization of player vis-a-vis the revenue generated by a club. Having said that, what is the position of FIFPRO in relationship to the introduction of the squad spending rule?
Well, look, first of all, thank you also to you, Andrea, to actually use our forum here today to launch your new edition of the Club Valuation Report. I think from our perspective, it's really important that players, as Hamid said before, educate themselves also on topics which are probably happening off the pitch, right? But which have a systemic influence and impact on the development of the industry and also on the working environment of professional players. And it's important that both players, but also the unions, obviously educate and engage on these conversations, and that we have a voice when we discuss these things. When it comes to financial sustainability, I think it's quite clear that from a player perspective, it's really important that we have a clear understanding and definition of what we mean by that. If the objective is about creating stability in the industry, I think this is something every player, every union would immediately support and sign up to. I think FIFPRO, the unions domestically, will always be a very reliable and trusted partner in these conversations and enforcing stability in the industry. Because you can imagine, as a player, if we have an unstable environment at the club side, the first one who will suffer from that, the first one who will be impacted is the player, is the contract of the player. That's the immediate target where instability will hit. That hits not just the player, it hits the family, the personal life. So obviously, it's a huge source of insecurity. And that's something no one wants. And that's also something every player wants to circumvent. And Andrea talked a little bit about the COVID period, and I think this is probably one of the best examples to actually really show that also to our audience, that while COVID was reaping through the industry, and we could see the financial impacts, of course that could be felt, as Andrea said, quite drastically at the micro level of the clubs across territories, specifically in lower divisions, right? Specifically where we were relying on gate revenues and not just on broadcast revenues. And that's where in numerous countries players restructured the contracts, deferred payments to actually protect employment opportunities from their perspective and to keep the clubs afloat. So there's a very clear commitment also from the player side to sustainability. On the other end of the spectrum, I think, of course, players have a very, very sensitive awareness when it comes to obviously also getting a fair share for the work and for the value they help to create in the industry. And you mentioned that before, right? We see in the next competition cycle as of 2024-25, numerous new competition formats entering the industry, which is quite likely generating even more revenue in our ecosystem. And if you would ask the players who you see here on the pillars with their quotes about actually playing more games, why salaries are capped, maybe for the benefit of a few investors, then I think they probably would be angry about that. But obviously we have, I think, a quite trusted dialogue also with Andrea and his team at UEFA, now with the new Financial Sustainability Working Group. I think that's also where discussions are taking place, and where we are addressing that. And I think from the player perspective, it's quite clear that there's a very clear commitment to sustainability and stability. When financial sustainability is used as a camouflage to actually protect earnings of a few wealthy individuals, the conversation is probably changing. But this is something which is ongoing.
Sorry to butt in. I actually do have a couple of questions for you, Andrea.
Of course.
And I do
Anyone can ask from the audience.
Yeah,
please.
not just me. I don't mean to take over or anything. But I do want to take it back a little bit when you were talking about particular clubs and being sold. Right now, we are waiting for the big sale to go through for Manchester United. Can you just tell us who are actually buying the clubs right now and what's their motivation?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's an excellent one. In fact, Andrea has also mentioned the word, or repeated the word I mentioned, institutional investor. Very interesting, today, just this morning on Bloomberg, there was a very detailed research they have done on the evolution of the ownership of club over the past 15 years. And what came out from this analysis, that 8 years ago, there were only 3 clubs out of the 98 playing in the Big Five that belong to either institutional type of investor like private equity or alternative asset managers or sovereign wealth fund. Today, we have 17. So from 3 to 17. And why this is happening? Because of this expected future stability, growing profitability that is going to characterize the sector. So this equity requirement for which you need to have a certain financial power, the squad spending rule, they are somehow all leading to a growing interest by this institutional investor. So while, let's say, 30 years ago, they were mentioning, I'm just reporting what I've read this morning, while 30 years ago in England, the typical owner of a football club was the local businessman that had a huge passion for football, 15 years later became the wealthy tycoon that decided to buy the club. Or if we think also in Italy, Mr. Berlusconi, one of the wealthiest Italian men who bought AC Milan in the late 80s. But nowadays, you have a completely different ball game with institutional investor buying club, participating in the media rights at different leagues like CVC in La Liga and in the French league. So the picture of the industry has changed completely.
Sorry, when it comes to the valuations of the clubs,
yes,
how does Football Benchmark come up with the valuations? Because, I mean, there's this famous saying that, you know, a club is only worth what the buyer is willing to pay for, right? So
yeah. I'm very often asked this question, and in a way, to basically defend our methodology. So, because basically what you are asking is, if we take, for example, the case of Manchester United that is on the mouth of everyone, where the expectation appears to be in the range of 5 billion GB pounds. So we are talking about 6 billion euro, where we are valuing close to 4. There is a difference of 50%. Okay, that's the expectation of a seller. We will see at which price the club will be transacted. But I underline the word price, not value. What you're paying for a good is not necessarily its value. So the price you pay for a service, for a product, in this case, for a club, it can be very, very specific to the financial position, the synergies, the benefits that the buyer could actually have from that acquisition. And that's where very often there is this difference between value and price. When we value a club, we always assume that the participants in the markets are behaving in a rational way. So we are looking at the future capability of a club to generate certain level of profit in order to justify a certain return on investment. When, I think in December or November, there were rumors that eventually Apple or Amazon would buy Manchester United for $6, $7, $8 billion at one point. It was it. To be honest, I could believe that number, because I could believe that acquiring one of the most important brands in the sport world and the synergies that those two entities could generate from that acquisition, it would be valuable to spend that money. But that is very unique to them. This, to me, is not something that, for example, Sir Ratcliffe can actually generate. But that's my personal opinion.
Have an opinion on that?
Simon?
Thanks very much. I asked a question about the value of clubs as more of a statement. If the value increases at the same time where you're asking to have cost control on players and the beneficiary is the owner who is benefiting by cost control and then benefiting by the value exceeding those numbers.
Yes.
That amount there, and I'll speak from a player's point of view, I've shared in the positive value, if you want to call it, or the profits that this person or company or fund has generated. So I wonder whether that works.
I mean, I think it's an excellent question. The point is, how do you share the value growth? I personally don't have an answer or a solution to this question. But if you look at this number, and you look at, this is basically the top 32 evolution of revenue beside the enterprise value and the staff cost. It's fair to say that the composition of the club has changed. So the top 32 club in 2016 are not the same top club in 2023. We have 3 or 4 Premier League clubs that, of course, have a wage bill that is significantly higher. But leaving aside this limitation, while revenue have grown by 47%, staff costs have grown by 70%. So in a way, we could say that the players are getting out the benefits of the growing enterprise value and the growing revenue of a club. If I look purely at this number, which I repeat, they are not perfect because the composition of the two samples is different. But how somehow to basically share that value creation, I don't know, Alexander and Andrea, if you have an answer to that.
You can take it.
No, look, I think there's one big question in the room, right, from a player perspective. And I would probably even, like, there is from a player perspective, when I just look at all of these numbers you have presented, specifically after COVID, I think there's a lot of pride from a player perspective in having contributed and basically creating and being a central part for the generation of that wealth and that value in our industry, right? And that's based on their talent, their sporting performance, eyeballs, people willing to follow that, people to invest into that property. And that's, of course, I think something where players should be extremely aware about. Now, I think the big question which we have as an industry is over the next years, specifically, as I mentioned before, with the new competition cycles coming in, and probably that goes also back to the title of that event. Like, what is there beyond growth? What is that value creation for, right? And I don't think that we as an industry have sufficiently answered that question. We should be aware that we're sitting in a market, in a country where we have a fantastic football tradition, which we will see over the next days. At the same time, it's an extremely volatile market, right? You have very big clubs with a very strong, rich football tradition, a successful history, big players, an attractive market for players. At the same time, you have instability in the markets with regards to overdue payables. I think that's probably the third pillar also of the new financial sustainability regulations, which are actually really, really important that we have to address. A lot of players actually facing overdue payables. So I think there is a conversation amongst the players who generate the value about what are we doing with that in the industry? What problems are we addressing holistically, right? Besides building our new competitions. And then, of course, there needs to be a fair share for those players at the top who are driving that revenue. But many of these players, through their upbringing, know many other players who probably haven't made it to the pinnacle of the game, what we're looking at here. So what are also certain protection and benefit schemes we could put in place for other players across our industry to actually make our industry more stable and more resilient also for the future? So I think that's conversations which we need to have. I think there's not a single answer at the moment to this is what basically players need to get out of that. But it's a really important conversation, what we as an industry do beyond the growth, which we will generate in the coming years.
Okay. If you don't have any comment, I will move ahead with another few slides, and then we're going to continue our discussion. So what are the clubs that have performed better since last year in terms of relative revenue growth? AC Milan was #1 club, growing their value by 83%. I remind you that the average growth in comparison from last year was 40%, valuing it 1.60 million euro. Again, a difference of approximately 200 million in comparison to the, let's say, rumored transaction price that was reported by media. So we think that that transaction should have happened around this value. Aston Villa is also a club growing significantly with 78%, but also growing by 3 positions, so 550 million. And then you can basically see the other 3 being West Ham, Manchester City on top of our ranking, gaining 5 positions, but going 64%. And then we have Villarreal. What is also interesting is that for the very first time ever, every single club grow their value, again, because the whole sector was actually growing. All clubs, they've reached their peak, with the only exception of AS Rome, when their top value was actually on the 1st of January 2020. I remind you that this is valuation at 1st of January 2023. If we look at the 7-year growth, so since when we started this publication in 2016, the best performing club in relative terms is Tottenham. They've basically grown their revenue by 2.5 times, so 247%, followed closely by PSG and by Internazionale Milan. If we look on the right-hand side, we see the club that have grown the most in terms of absolute value. And you can see that there are 3 clubs from the Premier League: Liverpool, Manchester City, and Tottenham. This club, they've basically grown their value by 2 billion up to the 2.6 billion of Liverpool. Bayern Munich, that I remind you for 30 years in a row, have been showing basically a profit as a bottom line. They've never been in the red, has grown their value to 1.7 billion euro. This is the overall ranking of the top 32 clubs that make up the 51.7 billion euro mentioned earlier. And as you can see, the overall growth is significantly for all clubs. Even a club like Wolverhampton, that for the first time make our ranking, it comes in 21st position with a value of 618 million euro. The club that has grown the least of all the 32 is actually Juventus, that used to be 10th, is now 12th, and their overall growth is 12%, significantly lower than the 40% of the entire sector. Last but not least, also because we are in Turkey, and there was a point that we used to have 3, most of the time 2 Turkish clubs. I want to focus a little bit on the runners-up. The runners-up are the 10 clubs that satisfied our criteria that I've mentioned earlier. So those clubs that are either in the top 50 by UEFA coefficient and top 50 by revenue, or they are in the top 30 by social media followership. If you take those 10 clubs, their average value is close to 300 million. If we take the average of the top 32, is 5 times more, 1.6 billion euro each. And here you have some big name. So we have the 3 Turkish giants, we have Club Brugge, we have Sporting Lisbon, we have Feyenoord and PSV, Rangers, and Real Betis. So those are the clubs that would qualify as a top club, being eventually, we have valued those, but they don't basically reach yet the top 32. So yes.
The runners-up club, did they have a similar growth rate in relative terms to the clubs who actually make the top 10 or top 20? Or was it more around the Juventus growth rate, for example?
To be perfectly honest, I wouldn't be able to answer that question. I would have to dig into it. But my expectation, it would be that their growth is actually lower, on the lower side rather than on the higher side. I'm now going to join the panel and opening up some further question. And I'm taking the example of the Turkish clubs, but my question is more of from a general perspective. Andrea, what can we do to basically try to decrease this apparently even growing gap that is being created between the Big Five league and even the big club within the Big Five vis-à-vis the rest of the market? And how somehow potentially the new regulation of the financial sustainability of which you are in charge are going to affect the competitive balance, which has been one of the, let's say, if may I say, criticism or collateral effect of the financial fair play.
Next question.
I know it's a difficult one, but I need to ask you something tough.
I didn't expect this. No, but so I think that the figure that you have shown about the enterprise value is just another metric, also to show a little bit a trend that has been that has accelerated after the pandemic, and I mean the concentration of values within, obviously, the top end, the top end of the market. And as you rightly said, when we talk about the top end of the market, we are mainly referring to the top 5 leagues, and as well within these top 5 leagues to a certain number of clubs, because not all the clubs in the top 5 leagues they get all these grow. There are, as you know very well, there are two main drivers. On one side, we have the broadcasting rights, which clearly define the interest that people have in following certain type of brands, clubs, teams, and that. But these are, let's say, the broadcasting rights are then redistributed more or less in certain ways. In England, is distributed according to certain parameters that are more balanced than in other countries. But then another metric which is driving as well this little bit this concentration, polarization, is sponsorship and commercial, because most of the value that is extracted from sponsors goes into 12 clubs. So really the top end. And this is money that is not redistributed according to certain parameters. This is money that belongs just to those clubs that generate.
And sorry to interrupt, I think you raise a very, very important point. And this is very much linked to the globalization of football, the transformation of the media market, and the fact that the top brand can capitalize on it and therefore becoming major commercial powerhouses.
Exactly. So the direction that football is following is not so different from the direction that other industries have taken, whereby you have more and more concentration towards the big actors within the market. Now, how can we address that? Now, I would like to underline something that we tried to really stress in the past, is that financial fair play was not meant to address competitive balance or was not meant to create a level playing field. Okay? It is about creating a more sustainable environment. This is also why we then decided also to change the name into financial sustainability, to really stress that the main objective is that. Now, the fact that we have to acknowledge the fact that no matter what you do, and this is with financial regulations or with sporting regulations, in some ways, directly or indirectly, you will affect as well competitiveness. So this is clear.
Absolutely.
But the topic is so complex that we cannot be naive to think that financial regulations can address competitiveness. This is a much more complex thing that depends from so many other factors that will need to be addressed at the same time. What we want with the rules is that, provided that there is already some type of polarization that is taking place, that clubs behave in a rational, prudent, and balanced way in order to avoid that this gap becomes even
bigger. Yeah.
So this is what we are basically trying to achieve here.
Very interesting. Alexander, one question come to my mind, thinking about this gap existing between, let's say, the Big Five league and other leagues from a player development, a player growth, talent management perspective. I mean, how do you see this difference in resources impacting on the growth of players and talents outside of the Big Five league, or even within the Big Five between big clubs and smaller clubs?
First of all, I think what has been said before is absolutely true, right? What we can see is that very basic economic principles of economies of scale are applying also to professional football and to clubs in the market, right? They benefit from their size in the market, and they capitalize on that. I think the centralization, as Andrea said, we see in many other sectors as well. Think about airlines or banking. I think there is a certain size in the market which can be occupied by certain actors in that. But obviously, sport is a little bit different, right? And players experience that. And I think this is then probably when you talk about the gap between the markets, this actually links back to the conversation which we had on the first panel on player workload, right? When we talk about player workload and excessive workload demands, then we're talking about the top elite players who are actually playing in those clubs or leagues and competitions who are breaking away, because that's where the value is. That's where we see more and more competitions being played, more and more matches being scheduled, right?
Yeah.
Those players are overload or face overload, whereas in many, many other parts of the market, players are faced with underload because we do not have enough competitions. Players would be happy about a competition which would go on for an additional month to actually have an additional month on the contract, right? An additional month of earnings and salary. And that's exactly the question which we face holistically as an industry. I don't think that we have a lack of resources and revenues in our industry. We also don't have a lack of available jobs for professional players. But we do have a lack of quality jobs, which is available to players, right? Professional football, like many, many other markets or entertainment sectors, is to a large extent precarious in certain playing markets. And then obviously on the top end, it's very redeeming and stable. So I think the question is, where do we find the balance? Where do we find the equilibrium? And that's, as Andrea said, that's incredibly difficult, right? Because that's where financial regulations meet with sporting regulations, different interests of different actors in the market. But nevertheless, I think this is the question no one really can avoid asking anymore. And the same goes actually to ownership structures, right? I mean, the ownership structures, as you have said, they're changing in the landscape in which we operate, and we have to discuss that. But it's not easy to find solutions. I think for us it's very clear that we need to reflect more on player-centric concerns when it comes to obvious protections on the top end, which can also help players to get more playing time lower down in the markets. But again, I think the details are extremely difficult, and we need time to discuss that.
Yeah, in fact, when I'm just reflecting on what I said earlier, saying that the effect, the financial fair play as create a sort of a collateral effect on competitive balance is only partially true, because I think that the other effect is what Andrea was saying, is the fact that those clubs have become so powerful, are capable of generating so much commercial revenue that has got nothing to do with financial fair play, but rather with the transformation of this organization into media and entertainment company with a global exposure, which gives them money, and therefore the gap actually increase. There is a sort also of a consolidation, and I like that example that you have made of consolidation like it could happen in the banking or in another industry like airlines. But I want to stay with you, Alexander, before asking a question on the same subject of multi-club ownership. From a FIFPRO perspective, the growing, let's say, number of clubs that are part of a multi-club ownership structure. These are data of CIS, and we can see how this number have been almost quadrupling in a space of basically 7 years. Is it a good thing or a negative thing for the players, from your perspective? I don't know if you have an opinion on that.
I think it's not so straightforward. First of all, it's a fact, right? It's there.
Yeah.
It's a reality. It's probably difficult to get this back into the bottle, right? I mean, I think from a player perspective, there's not something which is so straightforward where we would basically where we would have major concerns similar to what we had, for example, in around third-party ownership, in direct ownership of players, when it came to transfer rights, for example, or ownership of certain transfer rights a couple of years ago. I think that on the one hand of the scale, specifically in professional football, the game has also benefited from management know-how entering the industry. I think this is something which we can clearly say. I think financial sustainability doesn't just come through regulations. I think this also comes simply through better management and better governance on the club level, right? I think this is clearly something also when it comes up to the professionalization of the club ecosystem, something that has benefited the players, right? Because you can see that clubs are differently run, and clubs who are run very well actually have a direct impact on the contracts and on the commercial value of the club and their perspectives, and that usually benefits the players, right? So I think from that perspective, I think there's certainly a positive side to that. But clearly, when we now look at multi-club ownership structures, there are certain integrity questions which we have to look at, which are probably not
on
so
the
positive.
competition?
On the competition side,
Okay.
on the sporting side, on the contractual side, on the labor side, and I think this is something which, is one of the things I think we want to look at.
Andrea, from a UEFA perspective, I mean, this new phenomenon of multi-club ownership, how do you see it?
Is relative new, even though, I mean, there were certain type of multi-club structures that existed also 10 years ago,
Yeah.
but certainly the number of clubs that nowadays are part of multi-club investment structure has multiplied by 5. So it is a relatively new phenomenon to judge it, because why are investors investing in multiple properties, in multiple clubs? One answer would be probably to diversify risk of investment, because you diversify it among a larger number of clubs. If one goes down, maybe the other is successful. So this might be an answer for some, not necessarily for others. Others, they claim they want to use and leverage commercial synergies between the various franchises. Still to be proven if this will be a successful strategy. Others, they are referring to leveraging synergies when it comes to the training of players. So the possibility to obviously have an access and sign a bigger number of players through the various clubs, and then to probably train those players according to certain standards which are common to all the clubs that are belonging to the group. So they might want to benefit from that. I'm not a coach, I've not been a player, therefore I'm not in a position to judge whether these practices are beneficial for the players or not, and whether these would benefit to their career. Certainly is, as you said, a fact. This is what we have. Many of those investments are minority investments. In some instances, we have as well passive investments, not necessarily where the investors try to gain control over those clubs, but it raises a lot of questions, in particular when it comes to the integrity regulations, whereby the current one, whereby we are not allowing two clubs belonging to the same owner to compete in the same competitions. So these are obviously things that would need to be discussed further, and this is one topic that I would say I would consider as being particularly important for the future.
I think I would add to the motivation that you have mentioned, probably the desire of some of these multi-club owners in transacting player within the club, which you have limited, eliminating the possibility of recording profit, right, between clubs.
Correct.
Part of the same.
Correct. Okay.
Which I think is a very smart intervention from UEFA.
So this was, now you have to think bad about some that is willing to go around the rules, circumvent the regulations, by using tricks. So by using, I transfer a player from my club A to club B, and I book, I register a profit on the sale. In order to avoid that, exactly what we did in 2018, basically it was already done some time ago. We amended the regulations. Now we are saying if you transfer a player from A to B, you can do it. Obviously, this should be primarily because of sporting reasons, should not be for financial reasons, and therefore the profit, for the purpose of our regulations, the profit is not recognized. This is what we do. So we do not even enter into all those discussions about the evaluation of the players, which is very, very complicated.
Absolutely. But I think that potentially before was a motivation factor that with the introduction of this regulation, I think since last year, right?
Yes, we started amending it after 2018, and they were approved in 2022. Yes, it was the edition 2022, yeah.
It has eliminated potentially that motivation. I think from my side with the question, I'm done. If the audience has some question, I see Simon is raising his hands.
Are you getting money per question? I find this really interesting, Alexander, because you don't talk about this every day in the office, so we get to do this. But to UEFA, when we talk about multi-club ownership, and we know that the UEFA club licensing regulations apply to clubs that play in the UEFA competitions, if you're a multi-club owner and you have one club that does play in the competition and others that don't, is there a way to apply this licensing to ensure that we get a bigger spread? And I know that that's the objective of UEFA, to get this licensing structure spread further.
Yeah, so first of all, maybe this is more a technicality, but these kind of rules are not part of the licensing. These are part of the club competitions regulations. So when we rule about our competitions, we have rules now since 2001 that prevent the same owner of having two or more clubs within the same competition. Now, so we are referring to our competition. Now, the large majority of national associations, they have similar type of rules, or even stricter rules at domestic level. So if I'm not mistaken, if I take the Premier League, actually this multi-club investment is allowed up to 10% only. So I can control a club, but only have a stake in another up to 10%, which is considered to be a level whereby you are not exercising a certain influence by the governing body in England. In Germany, if I'm not mistaken, is a similar percentage. But you might have different percentages in other legislations. But the principles are there; they exist already. Let's take the example of Italy, whereby Lazio and Salernitana, when Salernitana,
Or Bari and Naples now.
yes,
Potentially,
but this is a potential. By the way,
Yeah.
it's playing tonight.
Yes, that's right.
Lazio and Salernitana had to be sold because they were competing in the same competition, and this is not allowed by the competition rules in Italy. It's not us. But let's say that these rules are more or less applied everywhere these days.
All right. There is a question here.
Since I have the microphone, can I go first for practical reasons, or do you have
Okay.
a mic?
Go ahead, and Michael is going to handle them.
Okay. Well, thanks to Andrea for co-hosting with us, and also for Andrea Traverso for involving us in the working group on financial sustainability, because I think on both topics today, we have to focus on the solutions that was addressed, and we want to be part of the solution. So, but since we are in Turkey, and we also have a board meeting tomorrow to support this market, it's very interesting to see that the top clubs fall out of the ranking. Can any of you in the panel or someone in the room explain why, and do you see them in the near future bouncing back? Because I respect and see this culture in this country so big, so I think we want them back at the top of the European football, both sporting-wise and also economic. Thanks.
I think I can partially answer that question, and maybe some of the representative from Turkey could help in answer the question. Certainly, the devaluation of the lira did not help the clubs in Turkey, because we are reporting our value in euro, and therefore, at the time we are converting their revenue, there is a sort of a wipeout of value coming from that. I think I heard today that Galatasaray is getting in euro 10 million euro because of the devaluation of the lira. So in the moment that your revenue are actually going down, somehow this is already impacting on your possibility of being shortlisted in our ranking. The other issue with several Turkish clubs that we have noticed, of course, is the deterioration of profitability. And taking into account that profitability is one of the key factors in applying the adjusted revenue multiple, that's also a negative fact. But it's very, very sad to see this devaluation to a certain extent of football in Turkey, especially when you take into account that if you take the top 20 clubs in the world in terms of followership, you would have amongst those 20 clubs both Galatasaray and Fenerbahce, which is amazing, which shows the passion that you have in this country. So I don't know if this helps in maybe addressing the issue.
Should I jump in?
Yeah.
Because to explain this in Turkey, so my background is sport consulting, so thank you so much for these kind of reports. You know, we always observe them and analyze them. But in Turkey, unfortunately, we don't see this whole economy as a brand. You know, when you compare this to Premier League and Bundesliga, La Liga, you have a professional league who's professionalized. You have sports marketer like Sport5 who support clubs, you know, to make, first of all, these revenue streams professional, commercialize it right. And in Turkey, unfortunately, we have Kulüpler Birliği, it's just a union, you know. And we don't talk about licensing agreements, like Premier League just signed us with Sorare, an NFT deal, huge deal, you know. They secure commercial deals for the leagues. They sell their rights correctly. We have here a problem with piracy, so that's why our broadcasting right deal got down, you know. So we don't have to invent the wheel, but we should just copy paste at least what the leaders are doing, you know, in this industry, like Bundesliga or La Liga and Premier League. So unfortunately in Turkey, if we don't see a club as a company, not just as a obviously dernek is more right, it's association, yeah. So if we see this as a professional company, this brand like Beşiktaş or Fenerbahçe, and then we see, okay, we have hospitality, we have to do hospitality like it Bundesliga or Premier League does, because it's I mean, I know I worked for Bayern Munich, so Bayern Munich makes 150 million euros out of hospitality every year. So that's like serious numbers. Like unfortunately here we neglect these topics, licensing agreements, hospitality deals, you know, then sponsorships. We have to be more digital because we have a great fan base outside of Turkey, but we are not activating them. Like, we don't get in touch with our fans outside of Turkey. So that only goes over digital. I mean, if I compare your runner-ups, you know, I mean, I work with these clubs. They have, first of all, very professional people working in the club. They do, we call it internationalization. They try to make football academies outside of Spain. They try to make commercial deals outside of their country. So these are all, like I said, this industry is very complex. It's a different industry. So there's so many, you know, components, you know, so it gets very profitable. And then also an investor comes in and then wants these kind of structures. They want a database, they want reports. And if we are lacking, you know, that's why our league cannot develop. It has to start at the top. Yeah. But my question is something else. It's not sport investment, but I love that we talk about sports investments because it's still a topic what is getting neglected over the years. But I would like to know from Alex. I'm also from Germany. I'm from Munich. So I would like to know what is the Do we guys understand that the players need to be more also financially coached? We talk about financial player advisory, you know. I think this is to give the player just to the handout to the agent. I think it's wrong because we talked about also the quality of agents. So I would like to know, like, what you guys have in mind. Do you think it should be a more topic? We should maybe collaborate with the right, you know, financial advisories, you know, and make maybe more educational programs. That's my question. What's your opinion about this?
Thank you so much. And thank you for the insight into Turkey. I think that was really elaborating and insightful for many of us here. Look, I think when it comes to player education, this is really something for us as FIFPRO. We represent 65 player unions around the world, right? So we are really the association of domestic player unions, mainly interacting on international labor issues. Now, when it comes to really the direct player contact, that's the unions in the country who are working with the players on a daily and weekly level, right? And this is something where education of players obviously is really, really important. And basically in union terms, you refer to that as player development, right? And that happens during the career, that happens post-career, that happens on financial literacy, that happens on education, that happens on mental health issues, mental health assistance related to sporting issues, but also off the pitch. So there's extensive counseling available, for example, also when you, for example, go to the PFA in England again, there are numerous player welfare programs existing. And just recently, the PFA also launched and created the PFA Business School, which is also an additional pathway to player education. So that independence, also the independence from the agent actually, is something which is obviously from a union perspective really, really important. But that also encompasses new topics, right? We just created Player IQ Tech, which is really focusing on everything related to technology, innovation in the workplace. So the industry is going through a massive change, as many parts of society, and that affects also the careers of professional players. And that's a massive job for us as unions actually, to also provide the assistance together in cooperation with the leagues and other stakeholders in the industry to actually have a player-centric consideration also on the education pathways. So long-winded answer to a very precise questions. Yes, we do that and we need more.
Samantha is coming to manage us. Everybody's
I see the evil eye.
Yes, I actually think this is a very interesting discussion. I mean, going on from what Julie just said, I mean, I don't know what you all think. Have you gone to, I don't know, certain investment bankers like UBS, I don't know, some other banks, and see if you can come up with a collaboration. I only say that because I know that there was a former NFL player who now works with UBS and looks after certain players and looks after their finances. So I don't know if that was, like, if you've tried that.
Yeah, no.
Not necessarily with UBS, but just like with any other investment bankers.
We haven't yet, but we are working a lot also with our player unions in the United States, the MBPA and the NFLPA, where I think we see more of these advanced programs being put in place. And I think it's a journey on which we are on as well as FIFPRO and with our member unions to increase that. And you actually have to go to Simon, who's heading our player relations and development department.
The man with all the questions.
I love him. He's also giving answers. He's not just asking questions, you know?
No, it's brilliant. I love this open conversation. I think we need to have more conversations like this. I think it's fair to say we could chat all night about this, but I don't think we can at the moment. So if anyone has any other questions, yes, no? I think we're going to conclude this forum. Again, thank you all for taking the time out for actually being here. To anyone who's actually watching on streaming, just thank you for your time and your company. To the production team, thank you for all your help. To the translators as well, thank you so much for being here and helping us as well. And for everyone who's just organized this event. So again, thank you so much. Have a great evening. Again, we have plenty of refreshments, so enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night.